Some wounds never heal and some men never learn to trust again. Gideon Bear Dalton knows this truth better than most. He's lived it for 15 years on his lonely ranch in New Mexico. This giant of a man stands 6'8", but feels smaller every day, talking more to his horses than to people. The folks in town know his name, but not his pain. They see the scars on his hands, but not the ones carved deep in his heart. But everything changes when two little girls show up at his fence one evening. These twin 10-year-olds are scared, alone, and begging for shelter. Bear hasn't opened his door to strangers in years, but something about these children breaks through his walls. What he doesn't know is that helping them will force him to face his darkest memories. Can a broken man learn to be whole again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first rays of dawn painted the mesa red as Gideon Bear Dalton stepped onto his porch, weathered work gloves already pulled tight over calloused hands. At 6'8", he cast a shadow that stretched clear across his yard, but there was nobody around to see it. That's how he preferred things, and had for the better part of 15 years. His ranch sat tucked into a valley where the high desert met the foothills, miles from the nearest neighbor and a hard day's ride from town. The isolation wasn't accidental. Every fence post, every building, every trail had been chosen with solitude in mind. This was a place where a man could disappear from the world, and Bear had done exactly that. The morning routine never changed. Check the horses first. Thunder, his black stallion, and Mesa, the old bay mare who'd been with him since the beginning. They nickered soft greetings as he approached, the only voices he'd hear until he made his weekly trip to town for supplies. After the horses came the cattle, scattered across the grazing land he'd carved from stubborn earth and endless sky. Then breakfast, simple and eaten alone at a table built for one. Bear had built this life with deliberate care, each day a careful construction of solitude. The cabin reflected his needs, functional, sparse, holding only what a man required to survive. No photographs on the walls, no mementos gathering dust. The past was a luxury he couldn't afford, and memories were burdens he'd learned to carry in silence. The weathered work gloves on his hands told their own story. 15 years of hard labor had worn the leather thin in places, but he couldn't bring himself to replace them. They'd become part of him, like the calluses beneath and the silence that surrounded him. Every crack in the leather marked another season of choosing work over words, solitude over society. But as the sun climbed higher that particular morning, something felt different. The air carried a tension he couldn't name, a restlessness that made thunder pace in his corral and set the cattle to lowing. Bear had learned to trust his instincts during his years alone, and those instincts whispered that change was coming. He was mending fence near the main road when he saw them, two small figures trudging through the dust, moving with the careful gait of those who'd walked too far on too little food. Bear straightened, squinting against the afternoon glare. Children, out here in the middle of nowhere, with evening coming on and no sign of wagon or horse. They saw him at the same moment he saw them, and both girls, for he could see now they were identical twins, perhaps 10 years old, froze in the road. For a long moment nobody moved. Bear had grown so accustomed to his solitude that the sight of other people on his land felt like a violation of natural law. The girls whispered to each other, urgent words he couldn't catch over the distance. Then the taller one, though they were nearly the same height, took her sister's hand and started walking toward his fence. Bear watched them approach with the wary attention of a man who'd forgotten how to interact with children, or anyone else for that matter. "Mister," the taller girl's voice carried clearly in the still air. "Mister, we need help." Bear set down his tools and walked to the fence, noting how both girls tensed as he approached. He couldn't blame them. 15 years of solitude had left their mark on his appearance. Hair gone grey at the temples, beard shot through with silver, eyes that had forgotten how to soften. He'd looked like what he was, a man who'd chosen the wilderness over civilization. "Where'd you come from?" His voice came out rougher than intended, rusty from disuse. "Our wagon train," the shorter twin said, then looked at her sister as if seeking permission to continue. There was shooting. Mama and Papa told us to run. Bear's chest tightened. He'd heard rumors of trouble on the trails, bandits hitting wagon trains, families scattered to the winds. But hearing it from the mouths of children made it real in a way that gossip never could. How long you been walking? 3 days, the taller girl said. Maybe 4. We lost count. 3 days. Bear looked at their torn dresses, their muddy shoes, the hollow look around their eyes. They'd been surviving on whatever they could find, 2 children alone in country that could kill grown men. What are your names? I'm Penny Morrison, the taller girl said, standing straighter. This is my sister Faith. We're twins, but I'm older by 6 minutes. Faith nodded solemnly, clearly used to letting her sister do the talking. She clutched something tight against her chest, a rag doll that had seen better days. Its dress as torn and dirty as her own. Bear found himself studying their faces, noting the determined set of Penny's jaw, the way Faith stayed half hidden behind her sister. They reminded him of someone, though the memory was too painful to pursue. Instead, he focused on practical matters. You hungry? Both girls nodded, though Penny tried to hide it. Pride, even in children. Bear respected that. Got some stew on the stove, he said, already knowing he was making a mistake. Suppose I could spare a bowl or two. The relief that flooded their faces hit him harder than expected. When had he last seen gratitude that pure, that desperate? When had anyone looked at him like he might be salvation instead of something to fear? Thank you, mister, Penny said. We won't be no trouble. We'll leave first thing in the morning, soon as we figure which way to go. Bear unlatched the gate, noting how both girls stayed close together as they passed through. Trust was clearly something they gave carefully, and he couldn't fault them for that either. The walk to the cabin gave him time to think, though thinking was the last thing he wanted to do. 2 children, alone and frightened, with nowhere to go and nobody to turn to. The decent thing would be to help them, but decency was a luxury he'd given up along with everything else. Still, he couldn't turn them away. Not tonight, anyway. Tomorrow, he'd figure out what to do. Maybe take them to town, let Doc Henley sort things out. The Doc had a way with lost souls, and Bear had long since stopped counting himself among the savable. Inside the cabin, he ladled stew into 2 bowls, noting how the girls' eyes followed every movement. They sat carefully at his small table, hands folded, waiting for permission to eat. Good manners despite their circumstances. Someone had raised them right. Go on, he said, settling into his own chair with a cup of coffee. It ain't much, but it's filling. They ate with the careful control of those who'd known hunger, making the food last, savoring every bite. Bear found himself watching them, despite his best efforts to maintain distance. Penny kept checking on Faith, making sure her sister got enough. Faith ate quietly, occasionally glancing at Bear with curious eyes. Where you planning to go? He asked when they'd finished. Penny and Faith exchanged a look he couldn't interpret. We got family in Santa Fe, Penny said finally. Uncle David, he'll take us in. Something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely sure about that, but Bear didn't press. Family business wasn't his concern. His job was to get them fed and pointed in the right direction, nothing more. Santa Fe's a long way, he said. Week's ride on a good horse, longer on foot. We'll manage, Penny said, that stubborn set returning to her jaw. Bear almost smiled despite himself. The girl had backbone, he'd give her that. But backbone wouldn't keep them alive on the trail, especially if there were still bandits roaming the territory. You can sleep in the barn tonight, he said. I'll rig up some blankets, make sure you're warm. Tomorrow we'll talk about getting you to town. We don't want to be no burden. Faith spoke up for the first time since giving her name. No burden, Bear said, and was surprised to find he meant it. Just for tonight. As evening settled over the ranch, Bear found himself moving differently through his familiar routines. He spread blankets in the barn's loft, making sure the girls would be comfortable, but giving them privacy. He checked the doors twice, something he hadn't done in years. He even found himself listening for sounds from the barn, making sure they were settling in all right. Later, sitting on his porch with the last of his coffee, Bear stared up at stars that seemed brighter than usual. The girl's presence had shifted something in the careful balance of his solitude. like dropping a stone into still water. He could feel the ripples spreading, disturbing the peace he'd worked so hard to build. In the distance, thunder whinnied softly, and Mesa answered. Even his horses seemed to sense the change. Bear pulled the cracked family photograph from his shirt pocket, the one he carried but never looked at, and for the first time in months he let himself remember Sarah's laugh, little Michael's sticky fingers, the way morning light used to fill their kitchen back in Kansas before the world went dark and took everything that mattered, before he became the kind of man who lived alone and spoke only to horses. The photograph trembled in his weathered hands as he tucked it away again. Tomorrow the girls would move on, and his life would return to its careful emptiness. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, his ranch held the sound of children's voices and the promise that somewhere in the world, hope still existed. In the barn he could hear them whispering, soft, sleepy voices planning tomorrow and dreaming of uncles in Santa Fe. Bear finished his coffee and went inside, double-checking the locks and trying not to think about how natural it felt to have someone to protect again. Dawn brought new revelations, and with them, the first real test of Bear's resolve to remain uninvolved. He found the girls already awake in the barn loft, whispering over something Faith clutched in her small hands, a tarnished silver locket that caught the morning light. "Morning," Bear called up, noting how quickly Faith hid the locket in her dress pocket. "You two hungry?" Over breakfast, Bisher watched them more carefully than he had the night before. In daylight, inconsistencies in their story became clearer. Their clothes, though dirty and torn, were well made, the kind wealthy families dressed their children in for traveling. Their speech carried education, proper grammar that spoke of tutors and careful upbringing. These weren't the children of ordinary settlers. "Tell me about this wagon train again," Bear said, refilling their milk glasses from the pitcher Doc Henley had brought on his last visit.
"How many wagons?"
Penny glanced at Faith before answering. 12, maybe 15. We were traveling with the Morrison family. She paused, as if testing the name. "Distant cousins. And your parents?" "Dead," Faith whispered, her hand moving unconsciously to where the locket lay hidden. "The bad men killed everyone." The pain in her voice was real enough, whatever else might be fabricated. Bear had heard that particular note of grief before, in his own voice, years ago when the world first went dark. After breakfast, he was checking the horses when Thunder's ears pricked forward, his whole body going alert. Bear followed the stallion's gaze toward the main road, where dust kicked up in the distance. "Riders moving fast! Girls!" he called toward the cabin, keeping his voice level. "Come out here!" They appeared in the doorway, still in their torn dresses, Faith clutching her doll. Bear noticed how quickly they responded to the urgency in his tone. Children who'd learned to read danger in adult voices. "How many men attacked your wagon train?" he asked. 5, Penny said immediately, then caught herself. "Maybe 6. It happened so fast." Bear pointed toward the approaching dust cloud. "That's 3 riders. Moving like they're tracking something." The color drained from both girls' faces. Faith grabbed Penny's hand, and Bear saw real terror replace the careful composure they'd maintained since arriving. "They found us," Faith whispered. "Maybe," Bear said. "Maybe not. Get in the root cellar behind the cabin. Stay quiet no matter what you hear." As the girls scrambled toward the back of the house, Bear positioned himself on the porch, rifle within easy reach but not obviously threatening. 15 years of solitude had made him cautious, but 20 years before, that had made him dangerous. Some skills never left a man, no matter how long he tried to bury them. The riders approached at a steady pace, 2 men in worn trail clothes and a third in a black suit that marked him as someone with authority. They reined up at the gate, studying Bear with the careful assessment of men accustomed to trouble. "Morning," the suited man called. "Name's Patterson. These are my associates, Dutch and Briggs. We're looking for some missing children." "Lot of country out here," Bear replied. "Children go missing. They could be anywhere." Patterson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. 2 little girls, twins, about 10 years old. They ran off from their guardians after a tragic accident. "Families are worried sick." Bear noted the careful phrasing. Guardians, not parents. Accident, not attack. These men were practiced liars, which made them more dangerous than simple bandits. Haven't seen any children, Bear said. Like I told you, it's a big territory. Dutch, a thin man with nervous hands, spoke up. Mind if we look around? Just to be sure. I mind plenty, Bear said, letting steel creep into his voice. This is private property. Patterson's smile faded. Of course, we respect that. But these children are in terrible danger out here alone. If you do see them, there's a reward for their safe return. How much? Bear asked, curious to see how valuable the girls were. $500 each, $1,000 for two 10-year-old girls. Bear had never heard of a reward that high for missing children, no matter how wealthy their families. Whatever these girls represented, it was worth more than their weight in gold to someone. I'll keep that in mind, Bear said. The three men exchanged glances. Dutch's hand drifted toward his gun, but Patterson shook his head slightly. Much obliged, Patterson said. We'll be checking with other ranchers in the area. If you change your mind about helping, we're staying at the hotel in town. They rode away, but Bear noticed they didn't head directly toward town. Instead, they circled toward higher ground, a perfect spot to watch his ranch without being seen. Professionals, then. Men who knew their business and wouldn't give up easily. Bear waited until the dust settled before calling the girls from their hiding place. They emerged, pale and shaking. Faith clutching her doll so tightly her knuckles had gone white. They're not from any wagon train, are they? Bear said. Penny's composure finally cracked. No, they killed our parents. They're looking for... She stopped, glancing at Faith. For what? Faith reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver locket, hands trembling as she opened it. Inside was a miniature photograph of a distinguished man in a federal marshal's badge, and tucked behind it, a small key. Papa was Marshal Thomas Morrison, Penny whispered. He was investigating bad men in the territorial government. He hid important papers before they came for us. Bear studied the photograph, noting the strong resemblance between the marshal and his daughters. The key was small, delicate, the type used for safety deposit boxes or document cases. They killed him for this? For what it opens, Penny said. Papa said it was evidence that could send important men to prison. He told us to take it to his friend in Santa Fe, but we don't know how to get there without those men finding us. Bear closed the locket and handed it back to Faith, his mind racing. A federal marshal's evidence against territorial corruption that explained the $1,000 bounty and the professional pursuit. It also explained why simply taking the girls to town wouldn't solve anything. Men with that much to lose wouldn't stop at the county line. How long ago did this happen? 6 days, Faith said. We've been running ever since. 6 days of being hunted by professional killers. Bear looked at these two small girls who'd managed to stay alive through wit and luck, carrying evidence that powerful men would kill to suppress. They reminded him of someone, not in appearance, but in the courage it took to keep going when the world had turned against them. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Sarah's face, as she pushed little Michael toward the storm cellar. Take care of him, Gideon. Promise me. The sound of gunfire. The smell of smoke. The terrible silence that followed. He'd failed to protect his own family 15 years ago, frozen by shock, while hired killers destroyed everything he loved. He'd spent every day since living with that failure, building walls of solitude to ensure he'd never face such a choice again. But here it was, the choice he'd tried so hard to avoid. Two children who needed protection and men who would kill them without hesitation. He could take them to town, wash his hands of the whole affair, and return to his careful emptiness. Or he could remember what it meant to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them, Mr. Bear. Faith's small voice broke through his memories. Are you going to help us? Bear looked down at her earnest face, saw Sarah's courage reflected in her eyes, and felt something shift inside his chest, a door opening that he'd kept locked for 15 years. Yeah, he said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. I reckon I am. The decision once made brought an unexpected sense of relief. For the first time since Sarah's death, he had a purpose beyond simple survival. The girls smiled, genuine smiles that transformed their faces, and Bear felt the first crack appear in the wall around his heart. But as the sun climbed higher, He couldn't shake the feeling that those 3 riders were still watching, waiting for darkness to make their move. The blood-stained locket Faith carried represented more than evidence. It was a death sentence for anyone who tried to protect its secrets. Bear checked his rifle and began making plans. 15 years of hiding were about to end, and the man he'd once been would have to emerge from the shadows. The question wasn't whether he could protect the girls. It was whether he could live with himself if he failed them the way he'd failed his own family. Outside, thunder rumbled across the mesa, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The rain that had threatened all afternoon finally arrived with sunset, drumming against the cabin roof and turning the yard to mud. Bear stood at the window, watching water cascade from the eaves while the girls helped clean up after supper, their first real meal together as something approaching a family. He'd spent the day making basic accommodations for children, a task that felt foreign after 15 years of solitude. Extra blankets appeared from dusty storage. 2 small beds were fashioned from hay bales and clean sheets. The old Bible that had gathered dust on his shelf for years now sat prominently on the kitchen table. Though he wasn't sure why he'd moved it there. "Faith's afraid of storms," Penny said, noticing how her sister jumped at each thunderclap. "Been that way since we were little." "Nothing wrong with being afraid," Bear replied, remembering his own son's fear of the dark. "Takes courage to be scared and keep going anyway." Faith looked up from where she was carefully washing dishes in the basin, her small hands working with the precision of someone used to helping adults. "Papa used to say the thunder was just God rearranging his furniture." The mention of her father brought a moment of silence. Bear had found himself thinking about Marshall Morrison throughout the day, wondering what kind of man could raise children with such quiet strength while investigating dangerous criminals. The kind of man Bear himself had once been, perhaps, before grief turned him into a ghost. "Your papa sounds like he was a good man," Bear said. "The best," Penny agreed fiercely. "He said his job was protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. That's why the bad men killed him." Bear finished loading his rifle, movements automatic from decades of practice. Outside, the storm was intensifying, which would provide cover if Patterson and his men decided to move tonight. But it would also make defending the ranch more difficult. "You know how to shoot?" Penny asked, watching him check the ammunition. "Some. Papa taught us about guns, but he said we were too young to handle them proper. Said we should run instead of fight." "Running's not always possible," Bear said, then caught himself. "These were children, not soldiers." "But your papa was right. Running's usually the smart choice." As if to contradict his words, thunder whinnied from the barn, a sharp warning sound that cut through the storm noise. Bear set down his rifle and moved to the window, peering through the rain toward the corral. "What is it?" Faith whispered. "Maybe nothing." But Bear's instincts, honed by years in dangerous country, suggested otherwise. Animals knew things humans missed, and thunder was telling him something was wrong. "Girls, I want you to go to the back room and wait. If I tell you to run, you head for the root cellar and stay there until I come for you." "What about you?" Penny asked. "I'll be fine. This is my land. I know every inch of it in the dark." Another sound reached them through the storm, the creak of a fence gate opening. Bear moved swiftly to extinguish the oil lamps, plunging the cabin into darkness broken only by the fire in the hearth. "Now," he whispered. And the girls disappeared into the back room with the quiet efficiency of children who'd learned to hide. Bear positioned himself at the front window, rifle ready, watching for movement in the storm. Lightning illuminated the yard in brief, stark flashes, and in one of those moments he saw him, a figure in a dark coat moving carefully toward the barn. Dutch, the nervous one from this morning, which meant Patterson and Briggs were likely approaching from other directions, using the storm as cover for a coordinated assault. Bear had faced similar situations before, back when he wore a badge, and such responsibilities came with the territory. The difference was that then he'd been protecting strangers' property and abstract concepts of justice. Tonight, he was protecting 2 little girls who called him Mr. Bear and trusted him to keep them safe. The front door was solid oak. reinforced with iron strapping, built to withstand both weather and unwelcome visitors. The windows were small and high, difficult to breach quickly. But the cabin had been designed by a man planning to live alone, not defend a family. Too many angles to cover, too many ways for determined men to gain entry. A soft scratching sound came from the back wall, someone testing the window in the room where the girls were hiding. Bear moved silently through the cabin, grateful for the familiar creaks and groans that told him exactly where to step to remain silent. Through the back window, he saw Briggs working at the latch with a thin piece of metal. Professional burglars' tools, confirming these men weren't simple bandits. Bear waited until Briggs had the window halfway open before acting. The rifle butt caught Briggs square in the temple, dropping him silently into the mud. Bear quickly searched the unconscious man, finding a revolver, a knife, and a leather folder containing official-looking documents. Too dark to read now, but he pocketed them for later examination. One down, two to go. Thunder crashed again, this time from the corral where his horses were penned. Not the weather, gunfire. Patterson was using the storm to mask the sound of his shots, probably killing the horses to prevent Bear from escaping with the girls. Rage flared in Bear's chest, a hot, familiar emotion he'd kept buried for years. Those horses had been his companions through countless lonely days. Killing them was both strategic and cruel, the mark of men who understood that destroying what someone loved was often more effective than direct violence. "Mr. Bear?" Faith's voice came from the back room, high and frightened. "Stay where you are," he called softly. "Everything's going to be fine," but fine was relative. With Briggs unconscious and Dutch somewhere in the darkness, that left Patterson, the leader, the one who'd done the talking. The dangerous one. Bear moved back to the front window, scanning the storm-lashed yard. Lightning revealed Dutch crouched behind the water trough, rifle trained on the cabin's front door. A classic pincer movement, one man drawing attention while another flanked from an unexpected direction. The smart play would be to wait them out, let them come to him, where he held the advantage of familiar ground and interior positions. But these men weren't going to give up and ride away. They'd keep coming until they had the girls, or everyone was dead. Bear made his decision with the cold calculation of a man who'd learned warfare in harder schools than most. He opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, rifle at the ready. "Dutch!" he called over the storm. "I know you're behind that trough. Your friend Briggs is taking a nap out back. Might be time for you to reconsider your career choices." Dutch's answer was a muzzle flash, and the whine of a bullet passed Bear's ear. Bear dropped to one knee and returned fire, his shot splintering the wooden trough and sending water cascading into the mud. "Last chance," Bear shouted. "Ride away now, and we'll call it even." But he could see Dutch moving, trying to flank toward the barn, where he'd have a better angle on the cabin. Time to end this before Patterson rejoined the fight. Bear stepped into the storm. The gunfight ended as quickly as it began. Dutch, caught between the water trough and the barn, with nowhere to retreat, made the mistake of underestimating the man he was hunting. Bear's second shot found its mark, and the nervous gunman crumpled into the mud, his rifle clattering away into the darkness. Patterson's voice cut through the storm from somewhere near the corral. "Dalton, I know who you are now." Bear froze, rain streaming down his face. The name hit him like a physical blow, a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 15 years. "That's right," Patterson continued, moving closer, but still hidden in the storm. "Marshal Gideon Dalton, supposedly killed by the same organization that murdered your family. Except you weren't killed, were you? You ran, you hid. You let everyone think you were dead while good men died trying to finish your work." Each word was calculated to wound, and Bear felt them land like bullets in his chest. The guilt he'd carried for 15 years, the knowledge that his cowardice had left others to face dangers he'd abandoned, rose up to choke him. "The girls don't have to die," Patterson called. "Just hand over what they're carrying, and we'll all ride away. Nobody else has to bleed tonight." Bear said nothing, but his mind raced. Patterson, knowing his real identity, changed everything. The territorial corruption Marshal Morrison had been investigating must connect to the same network that had destroyed Bear's family years ago. which meant these men weren't just hired killers. They were part of something much larger and more dangerous. Think about it, Dalton. You failed your own family. You're going to fail these children too. The taunt struck home as Patterson intended. But instead of paralyzing Bear with guilt, it ignited something else, a cold fury that had been banked for too long. "Patterson!" Bear called back, his voice carrying clearly through the storm. "You made one mistake tonight. What's that?" "You killed my horses." Bear moved through the darkness with the fluid precision of a man returning to his true nature. 15 years of ranching had kept him strong, but beneath the peaceful exterior, the skills of Marshal Gideon Dalton remained sharp as a blade. He circled wide, using the storm and his intimate knowledge of the terrain to close the distance. Patterson was good, professional, cautious, methodical. But he was hunting a ghost who knew these shadows better than any living man. When Bear found him crouched behind the remains of the corral fence, the confrontation was brief and decisive. "Drop the gun," Bear said. His rifle pressed against Patterson's neck. The man in the black suit slowly placed his weapon in the mud, hands raised. "You can't protect them forever, Dalton. Judge Cross has resources you can't imagine. More men will come, Judge Cross." Bear kept his voice level, but the name sent ice through his veins. Harlan Cross, the territorial judge he'd been investigating when his family was murdered. The man whose corruption had destroyed so many lives, including his own. Still alive, and still making problems for honest folk, Patterson said with a cold smile. "He sends his regards, by the way. Says to tell you that Sarah and little Michael died screaming your name." The rifle barrel pressed harder against Patterson's neck. "You're lying." "Am I?" "Cross was there that night, Dalton. Watched the whole thing. Your wife kept calling for you to save them, right up until the end." For a moment, Bear teetered on the edge of murder. The rage that had sustained him through the gunfight crystallized into something pure and terrible. Patterson deserved to die, had earned death a dozen times over by the fear in those little girls' eyes alone. But children were watching from the cabin windows, and Bear remembered what kind of man he'd promised Sarah he would be. Justice, not vengeance. Protection, not revenge. "Get up," Bear said, stepping back. "You're going to tell me everything you know about Cross and his operation." Patterson rose slowly, testing the waters. "And if I don't, then I'll let the girls decide what to do with you. Penny's got her father's sense of justice, and Faith's been having nightmares about men like you for 6 days. Something in Bear's tone convinced Patterson that he wasn't bluffing. The hired killer had faced down lawmen and outlaws, but the quiet menace of a broken man protecting children was something else entirely. "Cross has been building his network for 20 years, Patterson said. "Judges, sheriffs, territorial officials, anyone who can be bought or blackmailed. Your marshal friend Morrison got too close to the truth." "What truth?" "Land fraud, mostly. Stealing from settlers, selling mineral rights that don't exist, funneling federal money into private accounts. Morrison had documents that could bring down half the territorial government." Bear thought of the small key in Faith's locket. "Documents that his daughters are carrying. The key opens a safety deposit box in the First National Bank of Santa Fe. Everything's there, names, dates, financial records. Enough evidence to hang Cross and his whole organization, which explained why 2 little girls were worth $1,000 dead or alive. They weren't just witnesses to their parents' murder. They were carrying the evidence to destroy a criminal empire. How many men does Cross have?" "Enough," Patterson said. "And they'll keep coming until those girls are dead and the evidence is destroyed." Bear absorbed this information, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a familiar burden. 15 years ago, he'd run from this fight, choosing grief and guilt over duty. The decision had haunted him every day since, turning him into a shadow of the man he'd once been. But tonight, watching Penny comfort her frightened sister, he'd remembered something important. Some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the cost. Some people were worth protecting, even if it meant facing the demons he'd spent so long avoiding. "Briggs is alive but unconscious," Bear said. "Dutch won't be bothering anyone again." You're going to help me load them on their horses, and then you're going to ride back to Cross with a message." "What message?" "Tell him Marshal Gideon Dalton isn't dead anymore. Tell him if he wants those girls, he'll have to come through me to get them." Patterson's face went pale in the lightning flashes. "You're signing your own death warrant." "Maybe, but at least this time I'll face it standing up." As they loaded the unconscious Briggs across his saddle, Bear found himself thinking about the wooden horse he'd carved for his son years ago. A simple toy made with careful hands and infinite love. It sat somewhere in the cabin's storage, wrapped in cloth and forgotten, like so many pieces of his former life. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd find that horse and give it to Faith, not as a replacement for what she'd lost, but as a promise that some things could be rebuilt from broken pieces. The storm was beginning to pass, stars appearing between the racing clouds. Bear sent Patterson riding into the night with his message, then walked back toward the cabin, where warm light spilled from the windows, and 2 little girls waited for him to come home. For the first time in 15 years, someone was counting on Gideon Dalton to be the man he'd once promised to be. Morning brought unwelcome visitors and uncomfortable truths. Bear was checking the fence line where Dutch had cut through the wire when he spotted the dust cloud. Approaching from town, a single rider moving at a steady pace that suggested official business, rather than casual travel. The girls were inside. Faith, playing with the wooden horse Bear had retrieved from storage at dawn, while Penny studied the leather-bound journal they'd kept hidden in her doll. The journal, as it turned out, contained more than childish secrets. Marshal Morrison had used his daughter's possession to hide detailed notes about Judge Cross's criminal network, names, dates, and financial records written in a careful code that looked like innocent family observations. "Company coming?" Bear called through the window, noting how quickly both girls tensed at the announcement. The rider was a man Bear didn't recognize, tall, weathered, wearing a federal marshal's badge that caught the morning sun. He approached slowly, hands visible, following the protocols of a lawman who understood that most ranchers in this territory had good reason to be suspicious of strangers. "Marshal Jonas Creek," the man announced as he reined up at the gate. "I'm looking for information about Marshal Thomas Morrison and his family." Bear studied Creek carefully, noting the genuine wear on his badge, the competent way he sat his horse, the steady intelligence in his eyes. Federal marshals were rare in this territory, and honest ones were rarer still. "Morrison's dead," Bear said. "I heard tell his wagon train got hit by bandits." "That's what they want people to think," Creek replied, dismounting and approaching the fence. "Mind if I water my horse?" "It's been a long ride from Denver." Bear unlatched the gate, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed. Creek led his mount to the trough, taking the opportunity to scan the ranch with professional thoroughness. "Nice place," Creek said. "Peaceful. Man could disappear out here, live quiet for years without anyone bothering him. Some men prefer quiet, and some men don't have a choice in the matter." Creek's eyes met Bear's directly. "Tom Morrison was my partner for 3 years. Good man, honest lawman, devoted father. He was investigating territorial corruption when he died. Lot of corruption to investigate these days." Creek smiled grimly. "More than you might think." "Tom was close to something big when he was killed. Something worth murdering a federal marshal and his family to suppress." Bear felt the weight of Faith's locket in his pocket, the small key that opened doors he wasn't sure he wanted to see through. "What kind of something?" "The kind that involves territorial judges and federal land grants. The kind that turns honest officials into wealthy men, while settlers lose everything they've worked for." Creek paused, studying Bear's face. "The kind that got Marshal Gideon Dalton's family killed 15 years ago." The name hung in the air between them like a challenge. Bear kept his expression neutral, but inside his mind raced. Creek knowing his identity could mean several things, none of them good. "Never heard of him," Bear said. "Good man from what I've read in the files. Investigated the same corruption Tom was tracking. Got too close to some powerful people. Officially, he died with his family in a house fire. Unofficially, well, that's where it gets interesting." Creek reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather folder, opening it to reveal official documents and photographs. Among them was a sketch that made Bear's blood run cold, his own face, 15 years younger, above the caption Marshal Gideon Dalton, presumed deceased. Funny thing about that fire, Creek continued conversationally. 3 bodies found, but only 2 could be positively identified. The third was burned beyond recognition, but the dental records never quite matched up right. Bear said nothing, but his hand drifted unconsciously toward his rifle. "Relax," Creek said, raising his hand slightly. "If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't have come alone and announced myself. I'm here because Tom Morrison's daughters are missing, and I think you might know where they are." "What makes you think that?" Creek pointed toward the cabin, where Faith's face had appeared briefly in the window before ducking back out of sight. "Because Tom taught his girls to hide when strangers came calling, and because this ranch sits right on the route they'd take if they were trying to reach their uncle in Santa Fe." Bear weighed his options. Creek seemed genuine, but 15 years of paranoia had taught him that seeming and being were often 2 different things. On the other hand, the girls needed allies, and a federal marshal with connections could provide resources Bear couldn't. "Suppose the girls were here," Bear said carefully. "What would you want with them? To keep them alive long enough to testify against the men who killed their parents." Tom gathered enough evidence to bring down Judge Cross's entire operation, but without the girls to authenticate it, the case falls apart. Testifying means putting them in danger. They're already in danger. Cross has men scouring the territory for them. At least this way, their deaths would serve a purpose. Bear's temper flared. "These are children, not pawns in your legal game. You think I don't know that?" Creek's voice carried the weight of personal loss. "Tom was my friend. Those girls called me Uncle Jonas and sat on my lap during family dinners. But sentiment won't keep them alive if Cross finds them first." The cabin door opened, and Penny emerged, holding the journal against her chest like armor. Faith followed, still clutching the wooden horse Bear had given her. "Marshal Creek?" Penny's voice was small but determined. "Papa told us about you. He said if anything happened, we should find you or Marshal Dalton." Creek's face softened as he knelt to the girl's level. "Hello, Penny. Hello, Faith. I'm sorry about your parents. They were good people." "Papa wrote everything down," Faith said, holding up a small leather book. "All the bad things Judge Cross did. He said it would help put him in jail." Creek's eyes widened as he recognized the significance of what Faith was holding. "May I see it?" Bear stepped forward protectively. "Maybe we should talk first. Just the adults." "It's okay, Mr. Bear," Penny said. "Papa always said Marshal Creek was one of the good ones." As Creek examined the journal, his expression grew increasingly grim. "This is incredible. Financial records, correspondence, witness statements. Tom documented everything. With this evidence and the girl's testimony, we can destroy Cross's entire network, assuming we can keep them alive long enough to testify," Bear said. "That's where you come in," Creek replied, closing the journal carefully. "I know who you are, Dalton. I know what happened to your family, and I know why you've been hiding out here. But these girls need the marshal you used to be, not the broken man you've become." The words stung because they were true. Bear had spent 15 years feeling sorry for himself, while criminals like Cross continued their work unopposed. How many other families had suffered while he nursed his grief in solitude? "Cross will send more men," Bear said. "Count on it. But together, we might be able to get the girls to Denver, where I have people I trust. Federal courthouse, proper protection, a chance to end this once and for all." Bear looked at Penny and Faith, saw the hope kindling in their eyes at the prospect of justice for their parents. They deserved better than a broken man's protection, but they also deserved someone who would die before letting them down again. "How long do we have?" Bear asked. "Not long. Cross knows the girls escaped with evidence. He'll pull out all the stops to silence them before they can talk." Bear made his decision with the certainty of a man who'd finally found his purpose again. "Then we'd better get ready for war." The next 3 days transformed Bear's ranch from a peaceful retreat into a fortress. Creek proved to be a capable partner, his federal martial training complementing Bear's knowledge of the local terrain. Together, they prepared defensive positions, cached supplies, and taught the girls the survival skills they might need if everything went wrong. Bear's father's Winchester rifle emerged from its honored place above the mantel, cleaned and ready for the fight ahead. The weapon had served 3 generations of Dalton men in various conflicts, and now it would serve a 4th, not in conquest, but in protection of the innocent. Papa always said a gun was just a tool, Penny observed, watching Bear clean the rifle's action with practiced efficiency. He said what mattered was the heart of the man holding it. Your papa was a wise man, Bear replied, noting how naturally the girls had begun calling him Papa when they thought he wasn't listening. The transition from stranger to protector to family had happened so gradually he'd barely noticed. But now the word struck him like a physical blow, both painful and wonderful. Creek worked with Faith on the escape routes, showing her how to navigate by the stars and identify landmarks in the dark. The younger twin proved remarkably capable, her fear transforming into determined preparation under the marshal's patient guidance. If something happens to us, Creek told her, you remember what I taught you. Follow the North Star until you reach the main road. Then head east towards Santa Fe. Find Sheriff Martinez. He's one of the good ones. Nothing's going to happen to Papa Bear or you, Faith said, with the absolute certainty of a child who decided to trust the adults in her life. But privately, Bear harbored no such confidence. The enemy they faced commanded resources beyond anything 2 marshals and a pair of children could reasonably expect to overcome. Judge Cross had spent 20 years building his criminal empire, and he wouldn't hesitate to use every advantage to eliminate the threat the girls represented. On the 3rd evening, as Bear sat on his porch cleaning his weapons while the girls helped Creek prepare dinner, Penny approached with the quiet determination that marked her as her father's daughter. Papa Bear, she said, settling beside him on the wooden steps. Are you scared? The question caught him off guard. In the 3 days since Creek's arrival, they'd focused on practical preparations, defensive positions, escape routes, communication signals. Nobody had talked about the fear that gnawed at all of them. Yeah, Bear admitted, setting down his rifle. I'm scared. Papa was scared too sometimes. He told me that being brave didn't mean not being afraid. It meant doing the right thing even when you were afraid. Bear studied her serious young face, seeing so much of her father's courage reflected there. He was right about that. He also told me that some men are worth trusting with your life. Penny's hand found his, small fingers wrapping around his calloused palm. I think you're one of those men. The simple declaration hit Bear harder than any bullet. Here was a child who'd watched her parents murdered, who'd spent days running from killers, placing her absolute trust in a broken man who'd failed his own family. The weight of that responsibility was almost crushing. I won't let anything happen to you or Faith, he said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. I know. That's why I'm not really scared anymore. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Bear and Creek sat by the fire planning their final preparations. The marshal had received word through his network that Cross was mobilizing a significant force, at least a dozen hired guns, plus corrupt lawmen who could operate under color of official authority. We can't win a straight fight against those odds, Creek said, studying the hand-drawn map of the ranch they'd been using for tactical planning. Don't intend to fight straight, Bear replied. This is my land. I know every rock, every tree, every hiding place. Give me darkness and rough terrain, and I can make a dozen men feel like they're fighting 100. Creek smiled grimly. Tom always said you were the best tactical mind he'd ever served with. Guess I'm about to find out if he was right. Tom Morrison served with me? Early in his career, before he was married. He was green then, but eager to learn. You probably don't remember. It was just another assignment for you back then. But Bear did remember, suddenly and vividly. A young marshal with serious eyes and an absolute commitment to justice partnered with him during the investigation of a land fraud case near the Colorado border. Morrison had saved Bear's life during a gunfight with claim jumpers. Taking a bullet meant for his partner. He had a scar on his left shoulder, Bear said quietly, from where he got shot protecting his partner. He was proud of that scar, said it reminded him that some things were worth bleeding for. The connection explained so much. Why Morrison's daughters had trusted Bear so quickly, why Creek had sought him out, why this fight felt like more than simple duty. Tom Morrison had been family in the way that only fellow lawmen could be, and his daughters were Bear's responsibility by bonds that went deeper than law or circumstance. "There's something else," Creek said, reaching into his saddlebag. "Tom left this for you, in case anything happened to him." He handed Bear a sealed envelope marked with his real name in Morrison's careful handwriting. Inside was a brief letter and a small silver badge, a Deputy U.S. Marshal's star. The letter was simple. "Gideon, if you're reading this, I'm dead, and my girls need the kind of protection only you can provide. I know you've been hiding, and I know why. But some fights choose us whether we're ready or not. The badge is yours if you want it, signed and sealed, waiting only for you to pin it on. My daughters' lives depend on the man you used to be, but more than that, they need the man you can become. Don't let the past bury the future." Tom Bear stared at the badge for a long moment, remembering the weight of authority and responsibility it represented. For 15 years, he'd avoided both, choosing isolation over engagement, safety over service. "You don't have to decide tonight," Creek said gently. "Yes, I do." Bear pinned the badge to his shirt, feeling something settle into place that had been missing for too long. "Deputy Marshal Gideon Dalton reporting for duty." Creek smiled and extended his hand. "Welcome back to the fight, partner." As they shook hands, a sound reached them from outside, the distant whinny of horses moving in darkness. Creek reached for his rifle while Bear moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains. "How many?" Creek whispered. "Can't tell yet, but they're coming from multiple directions." In the back room, one of the girls stirred. Faith, probably, always the lighter sleeper. Bear caught Creek's eye and nodded toward the rear of the cabin. "Get them to the safe room," Bear said quietly. "I'll delay whoever's out there. We do this together. No, your job is protecting the girls. Mine is buying you time to get them clear." Creek hesitated, clearly wanting to argue, but the wisdom of the strategy was undeniable. Bear knew this ground better than anyone, and in darkness, one man could move more quietly than two. "Give me 10 minutes," Creek said. "Then do whatever you have to do." Bear checked his rifle one final time, the familiar weight comforting in his hands. Outside, the sounds of approaching riders grew closer, men trying to move quietly, but making the mistakes of those unfamiliar with the terrain. Judge Cross had finally come calling, and Marshal Gideon Dalton was ready to answer. The attack came at dawn, but not in the way Bear expected. Instead of armed men skulking through the darkness, a formal contingent arrived with the rising sun, territorial sheriff's deputies, led by a man in an expensive suit who dismounted with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Marshal Creek," the man called toward the cabin. "Judge Harlan Cross, Territorial District Court. I have legal warrants for the arrest of 2 fugitive children and their accomplices." Bear watched from his concealed position near the barn, noting the careful deployment of the deputies around the ranch perimeter. Professional, disciplined, operating under color of law, exactly the kind of challenge that made Cross so dangerous. Creek emerged from the cabin, hands visible but ready, his federal badge catching the morning light. "Judge Cross, what brings territorial court business to a federal investigation?" "The children you're harboring are wanted in connection with the murder of their legal guardians," Cross replied smoothly. "Sheriff Patterson was killed 3 nights ago, along with his deputies, while attempting to return the girls to their family." The lie was so audacious that Bear almost admired its scope. Patterson and his men hadn't been lawmen, they'd been hired killers. But Cross was rewriting history with official documents and sworn testimony, turning victim into perpetrator with the stroke of a pen. "Those children are federal witnesses under my protection," Creek said firmly, "not according to territorial law. And since this alleged crime took place within territorial jurisdiction, federal authority doesn't apply." Cross smiled coldly. "I'm sure you understand the legal complexities, Marshal." Bear saw the trap closing. Cross had positioned himself as the legitimate authority, forcing Creek to either surrender the girls or resist what appeared to be lawful arrest. Either choice would serve Cross's purposes. He'd either eliminate the witnesses or brand Creek as a criminal resisting legal authority. But Cross had made one critical error. He'd assumed Bear was just another local rancher, a minor player to be ignored while the real authorities settled matters between themselves. The judge had no idea that Deputy Marshal Gideon Dalton was listening to every word from 30 yards away. "I'll need to see those warrants," Creek said. "Playing for time, of course," Cross gestured, and one of his deputies approached with an official-looking document folder. Everything properly signed and sealed by territorial authority. As the deputy handed over the papers, Bear noticed something that made his blood run cold. The man's coat had shifted, revealing not just a deputy's badge, but also a small silver pin on his lapel. A distinctive design. Bear recognized from 15 years ago, the same pin worn by the men who'd murdered his family. Understanding crashed over Bear like ice water. This wasn't just about the Morrison girls or territorial corruption. Cross hadn't simply stumbled across evidence of his crimes. He'd been hunting for Bear himself, the one witness who could connect him to decades of murder and conspiracy. The Morrison investigation had been a trap from the beginning. Cross had allowed Tom Morrison to gather evidence, knowing it would eventually lead the marshal to seek out his old partner, the presumed dead Gideon Dalton. The girls were bait, designed to flush Bear from hiding and eliminate the last threat to Cross's empire. Bear retreated toward the cabin, mind racing through the implications. If Cross knew his true identity, then the judge also knew about his tactical abilities, his reputation, his weaknesses. This wasn't just a legal ambush, it was personal vengeance, 15 years in the making. He reached the back window just as Creek was examining the warrant documents, clearly stalling while trying to formulate a response to Cross's legal maneuvering. "Creek," Bear whispered through the window. "It's a trap. Cross knows who I am." The marshal's eyes flicked toward Bear's position without changing expression. "How?" "The deputy with the papers. He's wearing a pin from the organization that killed my family. Cross has been planning this for years." Creek absorbed this information with the calm professionalism that marked him as Tom Morrison's worthy partner. "Options? Run or fight. No middle ground now. The girls?" Bear glanced toward the safe room where Penny and Faith waited, probably listening to every word with the sharp attention of children who'd learned that adult conversations often determined whether they lived or died. "Judge Cross," Creek called, still examining the warrant papers. "There seems to be an irregularity in the territorial seal." "Impossible. Those documents were prepared by my personal clerk. Nevertheless, federal protocol requires verification through proper channels. I'll need to telegraph Denver for authorization before releasing federal witnesses to territorial custody." Cross's mask of legal propriety slipped slightly. "Marshal, you're trying my patience. Those children are coming with me today, authorization or not." "I'm afraid that's not possible." The transformation in Cross was immediate and chilling. The veneer of judicial dignity fell away, revealing the predator beneath. His hand moved toward his coat, and the deputies around the ranch shifted from relaxed containment to combat readiness. "Marshal Creek," Cross said, his voice now carrying the cold authority of a man accustomed to ordering deaths. "You're interfering with a lawful arrest. Stand aside or face the consequences." "The only consequence I'm worried about," came a new voice from behind Cross, "is what happens when you try to murder federal witnesses on my property." Bear stepped into view, his father's Winchester rifle held with casual competence, the deputy marshal's badge gleaming on his chest. The effect on Cross was electric. The judge's face went white, then flushed with a rage. 15 years in the making. "Gideon Dalton." Cross's voice was barely a whisper. "I should have known that coward couldn't stay hidden forever." "Judge Harlan Cross," Bear replied evenly. "I should have known a snake like you would slither out from under his rock eventually." The deputies looked between their leader and the man who'd appeared as if from nowhere. confusion evident on their faces. Some of them were honest lawmen who believed they were serving legitimate warrants. Others, Bear noted, had their hands already moving toward their weapons, the ones who knew exactly what kind of man they really served. "You killed my family," Bear said, his voice carrying across the morning stillness with absolute clarity. "I executed criminals," Cross replied, "just as I'm about to execute you. The only criminal here is you, Harlan. And your murdering days are over." Cross laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You think a disgraced marshal and a federal nobody can stop 20 years of careful work? I own this territory, Dalton. Every sheriff, every judge, every official with the power to help you is either in my pocket or in my grave." "Maybe," Bear admitted. "But you forgot something important." "What's that?" Bear smiled grimly, thinking of Tom Morrison's letter and the weight of the badge on his chest. "I'm not the same man who ran away 15 years ago, and some fights are worth dying for." The standoff stretched taut between them, Cross's deputies spreading out in a rough circle while Creek maintained his position near the cabin door. In the silence, Bear could hear thunder nickering in the distance, horses that would never be ridden again. Killed for the crime of belonging to a man who wouldn't stay hidden. "Last chance, Dalton," Cross said. "Surrender the girls and die clean, or watch them suffer like your family did." Bear's answer came in the form of the Winchester's lever action, the metallic sound sharp and final in the morning air. Around the ranch, weapons appeared in hands as the pretense of legal authority finally crumbled. "Creek," Bear called, without taking his eyes off Cross. "Get the girls to the safe room. This is about to get ugly." "Already done," Creek replied, his own rifle now visible. "They're secure." Cross raised his hand, preparing to signal his men, but Bear's voice stopped him. "Judge," Bear said quietly, "before you start something you can't finish, you might want to look around." Cross followed Bear's gaze toward the surrounding hills, where the morning light revealed what Bear had been preparing. For 3 days, carefully positioned rifle barrels, gleaming from concealed positions. "Among the rocks and trees, I may have been hiding. For 15 years, Bear said, but I wasn't sleeping. Every rancher, every honest lawman, every person you've wronged in this territory has been waiting for this day. You're surrounded, Harlan. The only question now is whether you surrender or whether we end this the hard way." Cross's face went through a series of expressions, disbelief, rage, and finally a cold calculation that spoke of a man who'd built his empire on the bodies of those who'd opposed him. "You always were too clever for your own good, Dalton," Cross said. "But cleverness won't save those girls when I burn this whole ranch to the ground." Bear's finger tightened on the Winchester's trigger. "Then I guess we'll find out who's been planning longer, you or me." The standoff stretched like a bowstring pulled to breaking point, each man waiting for the other to make the first move. Cross's deputies looked between their leader and the surrounding hills, clearly reassessing their odds as the scope of Bear's preparation became apparent. "You're bluffing," Cross said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "A broken-down rancher and a federal marshal don't have the resources to mount this kind of operation." Bear's answer came from the hills themselves, a series of reflected sunlight flashes, mirror signals from concealed positions that spoke of coordination and planning. One flash, then another, then a dozen more surrounding Cross's men in a careful net of crossfire positions. "Tom Morrison wasn't the only good man you've wronged over the years," Bear said quietly. "Every honest rancher who lost his land to your schemes, every lawman who couldn't be bought, every family you've destroyed, they've all been waiting for someone to give them a chance to fight back." Creek moved slightly, positioning himself to cover the cabin door while keeping his rifle trained on the nearest deputy. "The children are secure, Bear. Whatever happens, they're protected." In the hidden safe room Bear had constructed beneath the cabin's floor, Penny and Faith huddled together beneath the handmade quilt that had once warmed Bear's own family. The quilt, sewn by Sarah's loving hands, now served as a bridge between past and present, protecting the children who'd brought meaning back to Bear's life. "Papa Bear will keep us safe," Faith whispered, clutching the wooden horse he'd carved for her. "I know," Penny replied, though her hand moved unconsciously to the locket containing her father's key. The evidence that had cost her parents their lives was still her responsibility. Still the reason dangerous men wanted them dead, above them. The adult conversation continued with the careful politeness of armed men discussing murder. Marshal Creek, Cross said, "You're making a serious mistake. Federal authorities will not appreciate an agent who exceeded his jurisdiction and interfered with legitimate territorial business. Federal authorities will be very interested in a territorial judge who's been murdering marshals and stealing federal land grants," Creek replied, "especially when they see the evidence Tom Morrison gathered." Bear caught the slight tightening around Cross's eyes at the mention of evidence. The judge had assumed the girls carried only witness testimony, dangerous but manageable through intimidation or elimination. The existence of documented proof was a complication he hadn't anticipated. "What evidence?" Cross asked, trying to sound dismissive. "Financial records, correspondence, witness statements," Creek enumerated. 20 years of criminal activity, all carefully documented by a federal marshal who knew exactly what he was investigating. Morrison was a deluded fool chasing fantasies of corruption where none existed. "Then, you won't mind if we present his findings to a federal grand jury?" Cross's laugh was harsh and brittle. "There won't be any grand jury, Marshal, because you and your evidence are going to die here today, along with everyone else who threatens the order I've built." The judge raised his hand again, but this time Bear was ready. The Winchester spoke first, its bullet taking Cross's hat clean off his head and sending it spinning into the dirt. The message was clear. The next shot wouldn't miss. "I could have killed you just then," Bear said conversationally. "Still can, anytime I choose. But I want you to understand something first." Cross's deputies had scattered for cover, but their leader stood frozen, perhaps finally realizing that the man he'd been hunting possessed skills that 15 years of hiding hadn't diminished. "Understand what? 15 years ago you murdered my wife and son while I was away on martial business. You burned my house and tried to make it look like an accident. But you made one mistake." "What mistake?" Bear's voice carried the weight of 15 years of grief and rage held carefully in check. "You left me alive. And every day since then, I've been preparing for this moment." From the hills came the sound of men moving, not Bear's allies but Cross's reinforcements finally arriving. The judge's smile returned as he counted the dust clouds approaching from multiple directions. "It seems the odds have changed, Dalton. I brought more men than you anticipated." Bear had expected this. Cross was too careful, too experienced to commit his entire force to the initial confrontation. The men he'd brought to the ranch were just the first wave, intimidation and legal maneuvering, backed by minimal force. The real assault would come from professionals who understood that this had moved beyond law into open warfare. "Creek," Bear called without taking his eyes off Cross. "Time to go." "Already moving," the marshal replied, backing toward the cabin while maintaining his defensive position. Bear began his own tactical withdrawal, using the barn and outbuildings as cover while keeping Cross and his immediate deputies pinned down. The approaching reinforcements would arrive within minutes, but Bear had planned for this contingency. The safe room beneath, the cabin connected to a tunnel he'd excavated during the long years of solitude, an escape route that led to a concealed cave system in the hills behind his property. Creek would get the girls clear, while Bear held the rear guard, buying them time to reach safety. "You can't run forever, Dalton," Cross called after him. "I'll hunt you and those children to the ends of the earth." "Won't have to run much farther," Bear replied, disappearing into the cabin. Inside, Creek was already helping the girls from the safe room, their few possessions gathered into a single bag. Faith clutched her wooden horse, while Penny secured the journal and locket that contained their father's evidence. "The tunnel exit is marked by 3 white stones," Bear told Creek rapidly. "Follow the creek bed north for 2 miles, then look for the lightning-struck pine. Cave system starts there, plenty of places to hide until the shooting stops." "What about you?" Penny asked, her young face tight with worry. Bear knelt to her level, seeing so much of Tom Morrison's courage in her determined expression. I'm going to make sure the bad men can't follow you. You're coming with us, right, Papa Bear? Faith's voice was small and frightened. The word Papa hit Bear like a physical blow. In the space of a few days, these children had claimed a place in his heart that he'd thought was sealed forever. The thought of failing them, of letting them face the world's dangers without his protection, was almost unbearable. "I'll catch up," he promised, though they all knew it might be a lie. "You girls take care of Marshall Creek for me." Creek gripped Bear's shoulder. "Tom Morrison was right about you. You're exactly the kind of man children should look up to. Just keep them alive, Jonas. That's all that matters now." The sound of horses was getting closer, Cross's reinforcements arriving in force. Bear moved to the window and counted at least 20 riders, all armed and moving with the precision of experienced gunfighters. "Go," Bear said urgently. "I'll hold them as long as I can." Creek led the girls toward the tunnel entrance, but Penny broke free and ran back to Bear, throwing her arms around his waist in a fierce hug. "I love you, Papa Bear," she whispered. "Come back to us." "I love you too, little darling," Bear replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of you. More than you'll ever know." Faith joined the embrace, and for a moment Bear allowed himself to feel what he'd thought was lost forever. The fierce, protective love of a father for his children. These weren't his blood, but they were his family in every way that mattered. "Now go," he said gently, pushing them toward Creek and safety. "And remember, whatever happens, your Papa Tom would be proud of the brave. Strong girls you've become." Creek herded them toward the tunnel as the first gunshots began outside, Cross's men testing the cabin's defenses. Bear moved to his prepared positions, weapons loaded and ready, preparing to make his last stand. But this time, he wouldn't be fighting alone. Through the windows, he could see muzzle flashes from the surrounding hills as his allies engaged Cross's reinforcements. Ranchers who'd lost their land, honest lawmen who'd been forced from their jobs, families who'd suffered under Cross's corrupt rule. All of them united in this moment against the man who'd terrorized the territory for too long. Bear thought of Sarah and little Michael, of the justice he'd been too grief-stricken to pursue 15 years ago. He thought of Tom Morrison, cut down while doing his duty as a federal marshal. He thought of Penny and Faith, whose courage and trust had brought him back to life. Some fights were worth dying for. Some people were worth protecting, regardless of the cost. And some monsters needed to be stopped, no matter what it took. Bear checked his rifle one final time and prepared to remind Judge Harlan Cross that the man he'd tried to destroy was very much alive. And very, very dangerous. Outside, the battle for the future of the territory was about to begin, and Deputy Marshal Gideon Dalton was ready to finish what Cross had started 15 years ago. The battle erupted with the sudden violence of a summer thunderstorm. Cross's reinforcements hit the ranch from 3 directions, their professional discipline evident in the coordinated assault. But Bear had spent 3 days preparing for exactly this moment, and his defenders were ready. Gunfire echoed across the valley as hidden riflemen in the hills opened up on Cross's advancing forces. The judge's hired guns found themselves caught in carefully planned crossfires, their superior numbers neutralized by Bear's tactical positioning and intimate knowledge of the terrain. From his position in the cabin, Bear could see Cross himself taking cover behind the water trough, shouting orders to his scattered men. The judge's earlier composure had vanished, replaced by the desperate fury of a man watching his carefully laid plans disintegrate. Bear's father's Winchester rifle spoke again and again, each shot carefully aimed and precisely placed. He wasn't trying to kill, not yet, but to disrupt, to force Cross's men into positions where his allies in the hills could deal with them effectively. A bullet shattered the window beside him, sending glass cascading to the floor. Bear rolled away from the opening, noting how his father's broken pocket watch tumbled from his vest pocket. The timepiece had been damaged in the first exchange of gunfire. Its crystal face cracked, but its hands still moving, still keeping time despite the violence around it. Like the watch, Bear himself had been damaged by the years but was still functioning, still serving its purpose when needed most. "Dalton." Cross's voice carried across the gunfire. This doesn't have to end with everyone dead. Send out the girls and we can still negotiate. Bear's answer was another well-placed shot that sent Cross scrambling for better cover. There would be no negotiation, no compromise with the man who'd murdered his family and Tom Morrison. This was justice 15 years delayed, and Bear intended to see it served in full. The pocket watch ticked steadily in the debris beside him, marking seconds that might be his last. But Bear felt no fear, only a cold certainty that he was finally doing what he should have done years ago, standing between evil and innocence, using his skills to protect rather than to pursue his own grief. From the tunnel system, he could hear no sounds of pursuit. Greek had gotten the girls clear, which meant Bear's sacrifice was already serving its purpose. Whatever happened to him now, Penny and Faith would live to see justice done and their parents' killers brought to account. A new sound reached him over the gunfire, horses approaching from the east, moving fast. For a moment Bear's heart sank, thinking Cross had even more reinforcements than anticipated. But as the riders came into view, he saw something that made him smile grimly. Federal marshals, a full dozen of them, led by a man Bear recognized from wanted posters, Deputy Chief Marshal William Sterling, the legendary lawman who'd cleaned up corruption across 3 territories. Creek had gotten word to Denver, and the federal government was finally taking an interest in Judge Cross's activities. The effect on Cross's men was immediate and decisive. Caught between Bear's defenders in the hills and federal marshals approaching from the valley floor, they began to surrender in increasing numbers. Professional gunfighters were one thing, but few men were willing to engage in open warfare against federal authority. Cross himself seemed to realize that the tide had turned irrevocably against him. His shouted orders became increasingly desperate as his hired army melted away, leaving him with only his most loyal and desperate followers. Sterling. Cross called toward the approaching marshals. "This is territorial jurisdiction. You have no authority here. Judge Cross." Sterling's voice carried clearly across the battlefield, amplified by years of commanding men in difficult situations. "By order of the Federal District Court, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and crimes against the United States government. I demand to see warrants." The warrants signed by Judge Morrison herself, Thomas Morrison's sister, appointed to the federal bench last month specifically to handle this case. Sterling's words carried the weight of legal authority backed by overwhelming force. "Surrender now, and you'll live to stand trial." Bear could see Cross's face even from his position in the cabin. The realization that his carefully constructed empire was crumbling, that the corruption he'd relied on for protection had finally reached its limits. Federal justice had arrived in the territory, and even Cross's influence couldn't reach that far, but the judge wasn't finished yet. With the desperate cunning that had kept him alive and in power for 20 years, Cross began moving toward the barn, where Bear's horses were stabled. If he could reach a mount, he might still escape into the Badlands, where even federal marshals would struggle to follow. Bear saw the movement and understood Cross's plan immediately. The judge couldn't be allowed to escape. Too many people had died to bring him to justice, and too many more would suffer if he slipped away to rebuild his criminal network elsewhere. Setting down his rifle, Bear drew his sidearm and moved toward the cabin door. This had to end here today, with a final confrontation between the man who'd destroyed so many lives and the marshal who'd finally found the courage to stop him. The broken pocket watch continued ticking on the cabin floor, marking the seconds until justice would finally be served. Bear stepped into the afternoon sunlight, his father's badge gleaming on his chest as he walked deliberately toward the barn where Cross was attempting to saddle a horse. The gunfire around the ranch had largely ceased, Cross's remaining men either surrendering to Sterling's marshals or fleeing into the hills. "Going somewhere, Harlan?" Bear called, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd finally reclaimed his true identity. Cross spun around, his face twisted with rage and desperation. In his hand was a nickel-plated revolver, its barrel trained on Bear's chest. "You should have stayed dead, Dalton. Would have saved everyone a lot of trouble." Trouble's what you get when you murder federal marshals and their families, Bear replied, continuing his steady advance. Tom Morrison deserved better than what you gave him. Morrison was a fool, just like you, chasing corruption that was bigger than both of you combined. Cross's hand trembled slightly, whether from age or fear. Bear couldn't tell. You think killing me will change anything? I'm just one man in a network that spans 3 territories. Maybe, but you're the man who killed my family. Your family died because you were too righteous for your own good. Sarah and little Michael paid the price for your stubborn refusal to look the other way. The names hit Bear like physical blows, but he kept walking. Behind Cross, the horse shied away from the tension, sensing the violence that crackled between the 2 men. You remember their names, Bear said quietly. Good. I want you thinking about them when you meet them again. Cross laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. You think you're some kind of avenging angel. You're just a broken man who couldn't protect his own family. You're right about that, Bear admitted, stopping 10 feet from Cross's gun. I was broken, spent 15 years feeling sorry for myself, while men like you kept killing innocent people. But those girls in there, they reminded me of something important. What's that? Some things are worth dying for, and some people need killing. Cross's finger tightened on the trigger, but Bear was already moving. 15 years of ranch work had kept him strong, and beneath the peaceful exterior, the combat reflexes of Deputy Marshal Gideon Dalton remained sharp as a blade. The revolver fired, its bullet passing through the space where Bear had been standing a split second before. Bear's own weapon spoke in return, the shot precisely placed and immediately effective. Cross staggered backward, his gun falling from nerveless fingers as he pressed a hand to his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers, but the wound wasn't fatal. Bear had aimed to disable, not kill. It's over, Harlan, Bear said, keeping his weapon trained on the wounded judge. Your men are surrendering, your network is exposed, and federal marshals are going to take you back to Denver to face justice. Justice? Cross laughed bitterly. You think there's justice in this world? I've seen federal judges take bribes, senators sell their votes, presidents look the other way, while territories burned. There's no justice, Dalton, only power and those strong enough to take it. You're wrong about that too. The voice came from behind Bear, small but determined. He turned to see Penny and Faith emerging from the tunnel entrance, escorted by Marshall Creek. They'd heard the gunfire stop and come to see the end of their parents' story. Papa Tom always said justice wasn't something you found, Penny said, walking carefully around Cross to stand beside Bear. He said it was something you made, one right choice at a time. Faith clutched her wooden horse and nodded solemnly. He said even when bad men seemed to win, good people never gave up trying to do what was right. Cross stared at the children, perhaps seeing in their young faces the echoes of all the families he'd destroyed over the years. You think those pretty words will protect you? There are more men like me than you can imagine. Maybe, Bear said, moving protectively between Cross and the girls. But there are more people like Tom Morrison too, and now they know they're not alone. Marshal Sterling approached with several of his men, shackles ready for the wounded judge. Judge Harlan Cross, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, federal land fraud, and violation of civil rights under color of law. As the federal marshals secured Cross, the judge looked one final time at Bear and the children. This isn't over, Dalton. You can't protect them forever. Don't have to protect them forever, Bear replied, placing gentle hands on Penny and Faith's shoulders. Just long enough for them to grow strong enough to protect themselves. Creek joined them, carrying the restored family photograph that had been damaged in the gunfight. Found this in the cabin, he said, handing it to Bear. Thought you might want it. Bear looked at the image, Sarah and little Michael smiling back at him from happier times. But now, instead of pain, the photograph brought a different feeling. Peace, perhaps, or the beginning of healing. Papa Bear, Faith said quietly, does this mean we're safe now? Bear knelt to her level, noting how naturally the word Papa had become part of their family vocabulary. Yeah, little darling. You're safe. We all are. Penny studied his face with the serious expression that marked her as her father's daughter. Are you going to adopt us for real now? Make it official? The question caught Bear off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. In the space of a week, these children had transformed from strangers to family, filling the empty spaces in his heart with their courage and trust. "If you'll have me," Bear said simply. "I know I'm not your real papa, but you are our real papa," Faith interrupted fiercely. "The kind that chooses to love us even when he doesn't have to." Sterling approached with documents in his hand. "Deputy Marshal Dalton, I'll need your testimony for the federal case against Cross. The Attorney General wants to make sure this conviction sticks." "You'll have it," Bear promised, standing to face his superior officer. "Whatever it takes to put him away for good." "There's something else," Sterling continued. "The Marshal Service could use someone with your experience. Denver's offering you a permanent position, Chief Deputy for Territorial Operations. Good pay, federal authority, chance to clean up the kind of corruption that's been festering out here." Bear looked down at Penny and Faith, seeing hope and worry warring in their young faces. They'd lost one father to the demands of justice. Would they lose another? "Can I think about it?" Bear asked. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands whenever you're ready." As Sterling and his men led Cross away in shackles, Bear found himself alone with Creek and the girls on the ranch that had been his refuge for 15 years. The sun was setting behind the mesa, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Marshal Creek," Penny said formally, "thank you for helping us find Papa Bear." Creek smiled and tipped his hat. "Thank you for reminding an old lawman what we're really fighting for." As Creek prepared to leave with Sterling's marshals, he pulled Bear aside for a private word. "Tom Morrison would be proud," he said quietly, "of his girls and of the man who stepped up to protect them. Tom was the brave one. I just finally stopped running. Sometimes that's the hardest kind of courage there is." After the marshals departed, Bear sat on his porch with Penny and Faith, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The wooden sign by the gate, the one that had read G. Dalton Private Property, would need changing soon. "Papa Bear," Faith said, curled against his side with her wooden horse. "What happens now?" Bear thought about Sterling's offer, about the chance to return to active duty and continue Tom Morrison's work. He thought about the ranch, about the quiet life he'd built from grief and solitude. Mostly, he thought about the two little girls who'd brought light back into his world. "Now we become a real family," he said simply. "Whatever else happens, we're together." Penny nodded seriously. The Dalton family," Bear agreed, feeling the words settle into his heart like a promise finally kept. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient courses, and for the first time in 15 years, Deputy Marshal Gideon Dalton looked toward the future with hope instead of regret. 6 months later, the new wooden sign by the gate read, "The Dalton Ranch, home of Bear, Penny and Faith," in letters carved with careful precision. Bear had made the sign himself during the long winter evenings. Working by lamplight while the girls did their schoolwork at the kitchen table, the ranch bore little resemblance to the isolated fortress it had been during the siege. Where bullet holes had scarred the cabin walls, fresh timber now gleamed with new paint. The barn had been rebuilt and expanded, housing not just Bear's replacement horses, but also the milk cow Faith had convinced him they needed. For fresh butter, she'd argued with the irrefutable logic of a 10-year-old. And because cows are friendly, Bear hadn't had the heart to tell her that his previous solitary existence had been perfectly content without friendly livestock. Now, watching Faith feed the cow she'd named Buttercup, he couldn't imagine the ranch without it. The morning routine had changed dramatically. Instead of silent chores performed in isolation, breakfast was a lively affair, filled with chatter about school lessons, plans for the day, and the 1,000 small concerns that filled children's lives. Penny had become his unofficial ranch foreman, organizing their activities with the same quiet competence she'd shown during their desperate flight from Cross's men. "Papa Bear," she announced over pancakes. "Faith and I have been talking about your marshal job." Bear looked up from his coffee, noting the serious expression that always preceded important family discussions. In the months since the trial, Sterling had renewed his offer several times, each occasion prompting lengthy conversations between the three of them. "Have you now?" "We think you should take it," Faith said, surprising him. She'd been the most resistant to the idea of him returning to active duty, perhaps fearing that wearing a badge again would somehow put him in danger. "What changed your mind, little darling?" Faith considered her words carefully, a habit she'd developed when discussing serious matters. "You're different when you talk about martial work." "Happy different, not sad different. Happy different. When you were just a rancher, you smiled, but your eyes stayed sad," Penny explained. "But when you talk about catching bad men and helping good people, your eyes smile too." Bear marveled at their perception. Children, he'd learned, saw things adults often missed, the subtle signs of contentment or restlessness that even the person experiencing them might not recognize. "And if I take the job, what happens to you two?" "We come with you," Penny said matter-of-factly. "Deputy marshals travel sometimes, right? We could see different places, meet different people, like Papa Tom used to do before he settled down." The reference to their birth father was casual now, free of the grief that had colored their early conversations. They spoke of Tom Morrison with love and pride, but also with the healthy acceptance of children who'd found new family without forgetting the old. After breakfast, Bear walked them to the schoolhouse that had been built in town during the winter months. The new teacher, Miss Caroline Wright, was a young woman from Denver who'd come west seeking adventure and found a calling in educating frontier children. "Morning. Marshal Dalton," she greeted him with a smile that held just a hint of personal interest. Bear touched his hat brim politely. "Miss Wright. Girls been behaving themselves?" "Angels, both of them, though Penny's been helping the younger children with their arithmetic again. I think she has a natural talent for teaching." Bear felt the familiar surge of pride that had become as natural as breathing. Watching his daughters, for that's what they were now, legally and emotionally, develop their own personalities and talents was a daily source of wonder. On the ride back to the ranch, Bear stopped at the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley. 2 new graves had been added since the gunfight, Tom and Helen Morrison. Their bodies finally recovered and given proper burial beside other good people who'd made the territory their home. But today, Bear's destination was different. At the far end of the cemetery, under a spreading oak tree, 2 older graves marked the resting place of Sarah and Michael Dalton. For years, Bear had avoided this spot, unable to face the reminder of his failure to protect them. Now he knelt between the graves, pulling weeds and straightening the wooden crosses that marked their final rest. "I brought them home. Sarah," he said quietly, placing fresh wildflowers by each marker. "The girls, I mean. Tom Morrison's daughters. They remind me of Michael sometimes, brave and stubborn and full of questions about everything." A gentle breeze stirred the oak leaves above him, and Bear chose to interpret it as approval. "I'm thinking of taking that marshal job Sterling offered. The girls want me to, and I think they're right. Hiding didn't bring you back, and it didn't help anyone else either. But maybe working again, protecting other families like ours, maybe that's how I honor what we had." He stayed for a few more minutes, feeling the peace that had eluded him for so many years. The guilt was still there, would always be there, but it no longer dominated his thoughts. Penny and Faith had taught him that love wasn't diminished by loss, that families could be rebuilt from broken pieces, that hope was always possible if you were brave enough to reach for it. That evening, as Bear tucked the girls into their beds, Faith voiced the question that had been hovering at the edges of their family conversations. "Papa Bear, if you're a marshal again, will you have to go away sometimes?" "Sometimes," Bear admitted. "But I'll always come home. And when you're older, maybe you'll come with me on the safer assignments. Promise?" "I promise. Nothing in this world is going to separate this family again." Penny, ever practical, had already moved on to logistics. "When do we leave for Denver?" "Next month, if you're sure about this." "We're sure," both girls said simultaneously, then giggled at their synchronization. Later, sitting on the porch with his evening coffee, Bear looked up at the stars that had witnessed so much grief and healing. Loss and redemption, the end of one family and the beginning of another. In his pocket, the restored family photograph now included a new image of himself with Penny and Faith, all three of them smiling with the genuine happiness of people who'd found where they belonged. Deputy Chief Marshal Gideon Dalton would report for duty in Denver next month, bringing with him 15 years of hard-earned wisdom and 2 remarkable daughters who taught him that some broken things could indeed be made whole again. The wooden sign by the gate would need updating soon, to include their new address in Denver and Bear's new title. But the important part would remain the same. Home of Bear, Penny and Faith, because in the end, that's what mattered most. Not the place or the job or the past that had shaped them, but the love that bound them together as family. And that love, Bear knew, was strong enough to weather whatever challenges the future might bring.